All right, it's now go.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and press who are watching the live stream of this meeting via the Council's website. Due to government guidance and social distancing, this meeting is being held remotely in line with revised guidance received from the Department for Education. Minutes of the meeting will be produced in the usual way, and a recording will be available to view on the meeting page of the Council's website. To enable the meeting to run in an orderly manner, I would ask all members of Forum who have video cameras to keep their video cameras switched on for the duration of the meeting and to keep their microphone muted unless I ask you to speak. Officers will join us to introduce reports in the same way. Any members wishing to ask questions or make a comment should indicate this by clicking the raised hand function on the right-hand side of their screen. When I invite you to speak, please unmute your microphone, ask your question, then mute it again to allow the officer to respond. I'll obviously ask for your patience if we run into technical problems, and should this occur, I will declare an adjournment while the fault is addressed and the public broadcast will be paused. If it is not possible to address the fault, the meeting may be abandoned until such a time as it can be reconvened. It's also worth noting as well that we need to make sure the meeting is concluded by 12 o'clock. I believe IT services need to do some migration work. So I will seek to keep the debate and discussion to the point and with an eye on the clock. At this point, we'll actually establish a roll call to establish who is present. I'm now going to pass over to Rob Sanderson in Democratic Services to undertake that.
Thank you, Chairman. If I could do the roll call. I'll start with voting members of Forum. Simon Bainbridge.
Good morning, yes, I'm present.
Adrian Ball.
Yeah, morning.
Liz Bassett. Not there. Christopher Bennett.
Good morning, everybody.
Susanna Connell.
Morning.
Tony Davis, substituting for Sasha Howard. Not there at the moment. Joanne Hardwick, sorry.
Good morning.
Ryan Kelsall.
Good morning.
John King.
Good morning.
Jeremy Lloyd. Not there at the moment.
Oh, I've just joined.
Leah Miller.
Good morning.
Claire Palmer.
Good morning.
Deborah Parfitt.
Good morning.
Patsy Perez.
Morning.
Richard Spencer.
Morning, everybody.
Paul Stratford.
Morning.
Guy Underwood.
Good morning, everybody.
John Colpin.
Morning.
Councillor Simon Bywater.
Good morning.
Julie Cornwell.
Morning, sorry.
Councillor Peter Downs.
Good morning.
Councillor John Devine. John Devine, not councillor.
I thought I'd been elevated. Present.
Sorry, I keep getting interrupted by my phone. Andrew Reid.
Morning.
Councillor Simone Taylor.
Hello, good morning.
Can I just check if I've missed any Forum members or observers from those that I read out?
Okay, shall we proceed? Okay, first of all, would the Democratic Services Officer report any apologies for absence?
Apologies for absence is Sasha Howard. I'll look to seeing Tony Davis where he is. And that's the only apology.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we do have some new members attending Forum, and can I at stage extend a very warm welcome to Leah Miller, representing the maintained pupil referral unit to her first meeting, and also to Simon Bainbridge, who, although in the past has been a substitute for Kim Taylor, is now the representative for Academy Special Schools. You're both very welcome to Forum. It's also my duty to have to inform you of the resignation earlier this week of former chairman Philip Hodgson, who has resigned for personal reasons. I know that we'll all want to wish him well for the future, and can I ask Democratic Services to write on behalf of the forum to express our deep gratitude for the years of service that he has provided to both forum and to the children of the county in his tireless efforts, along with the previous vice chairman, the late Dr. Alan Roger, in lobbying for a better grant settlement for Cambridgeshire. Challenges which remain, of course, and which also feature heavily on today's agenda. Moving back to the agenda, does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? If so, please do raise the blue hand. Okay, I can't see anybody declaring any interest, so thank you very much. And we now move on to the second item on the agenda, which is to review the minutes of the 17th of July. And this is to agree the minutes for accuracy. I shall go through the minutes page by page. Please raise your blue hand if you wish to raise a point of accuracy only. So if you can make sure you have the minutes in front of you, I'm going to start with page 3. Page 4. Page 5. Page 6. Page 7. Page 8. Page 9. Page 10. Page 11. And finally, page 12. In which case, then, as I can't see anybody's hand being raised, can we agree the minutes as a correct record? And I will sign a hard copy when eventually we return to Shire Hall, which I shall imagine will be quite an extensive sheaf of papers when we actually get there. Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to item 3, the minutes action log. An updated action log was included in the published papers for this meeting. John, do you have any further updates to add since publication in relation to item 2 on whether a letter of representation was sent to government to request additional funding, and also on item 4, whether any discussions have taken place regarding seeking to obtain a greater degree of ethnic diversity for future forum appointments? John.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. In terms of the letter, you'll see on the next report we're going to cover, we have met with the MPs and what they've agreed is a joint letter from all the MPs for Cambridgeshire to go into government. So we felt, probably given we've written so many letters in the last couple of years, that may be a more effective approach to making sure our representation are heard, although we have been in regular correspondence with the Department for Education on the high needs, and I'll cover that later on. In terms of the membership, we've had quite a lot of change in members. We have quite a lot of vacancies at the moment. We did say that we would formally review the constitution in the next meeting, and it's my intention to go and have the conversation with all the forming bodies that decide membership to remind them of their role and responsibility around ensuring that we are an inclusive and diverse forum, and ask them to consider that as part of their processes. So if we could put that on the next meeting agenda, Chair, I will come back with something more formal when we've had a chance to sort of give a view and get some feedback from each of the groups that are represented.
Thank you very much, John. Has any other member of forum got a question they'd like to raise in relation to the action log? And I can't see any hands going up. Okay, so no members have indicated they wish to speak, so we'll take the action log as noted. In which case then we'll move on to item 4 of the agenda, which is the school funding update. And can I please ask John Lewis and Martin Way to introduce this report, taking the report in stages and voting as appropriate.
Brilliant. Thank you. And how delightful it is not to talk about COVID for a little while. I just wish the content was slightly easier to have a conversation with you about. So I think Martin is going to bring up the presentation on screen. What I suggest we do is go through it fairly rapidly. We've obviously been through a budget consultation process. If you wanted to see the extended version, I'm happy to send you the YouTube video so you can see the more detail that we're going to go through. But what we're going to do is step through each of the sections and alternate between myself and Martin, sort of outline the issues and the concerns, and then seek your approval in terms of your view on where we should be going. I think if you refer to the main report quickly before we go into the presentation in a bit more detail, the 1.6 of the report lays out the role of Schools Forum in the budget setting process. So essentially what we are doing today is that we are proposing to you the budget that we've put forward. There are some options on the table, and again, we'll cover those in infinite detail. This is a consultation with forum members. We don't consult with individual schools, although we have done that to help you to form your views. And ultimately, decision making will be the local authorities, obviously within the constraints that of the transfers of funding between blocks. So we decide the budget. The steps come up later. We will have several goes at this in terms of this forum meeting. So there will be chances to bring more information so you can work that through. Obviously, we will get feedback from council members through the CYP committee, which Councillor Simon Bywater chairs, and we will make sure that everyone is joined up in terms of the overall position. So hopefully that's clear in terms of process. Martin, I don't know if you can click on display, because I can only see it's very small. So if you could put it, if you could play it so I can see it, because fortunately I've got some IT issues today, so I'm doing this on my phone. I can't actually read the slides. It's fine. I'll manage, Martin. Don't worry. Okay. So in terms of where we are with the budget settlement, obviously the schools block, we're in the second of 2 years, 3 years now of a settlement. This year is complicated because of an additional transfer of resources through the teachers' pay grant and the pension employer grant into the formula. That will create turbulence. It does create turbulence in terms of the figures that are presented. And we have also seen that change has been mainstreamed through an adjustment to the minimum per pupil levels. You'll remember from the conversation we had last year, minimum per pupil levels was the most challenging issue we had to deal with about how that would work and the impact. And you'll be unsurprised again that is the concern that we are going to share with you again this year in terms of the budget settlement. So you want to move on, Martin? In terms of the overall settlement, it's an increase of 30 million. As we said, about 18 million of this relates to that grant transfer. So the net increase is around 13 million, which is around 3.4%, which in the context of a pay award sitting at around 2.75% means that many schools will have challenges with this. And I think when we then look at the options that we have available and the things we've suggested around block transfers, we're actually quite limited in terms of the options we have available to us in terms of that work. Now, as we stand here today, everything we're presenting to you relates to the data from the October census from 2019. We have parts of the 2020 census, but we do not have a full data set yet. Hence why we will need to go through an iterative process with you, sharing updated figures. And at the moment, modelling has been based on that census, and it can change quite dramatically with the pupil numbers. The one area we'll highlight is around the IDACI. This is the Index of Deprivation Affecting Children, essentially that socioeconomic measure of deprivation. That has been changed and updated. And one of the things that we will be doing is sending out to schools shortly a sort of analysis of how that's changed, because there's quite a lot of complex detail behind that. And I'm really keen that people understand relatively their deprivation level. But, you know, we will obviously be modelling that in terms of the budget forecast when they come through. The other change we've got is around sparsity. This has provoked quite a lot of national debate and concern. Essentially, sparsity is there to support rural schools, principally small rural schools. And we've talked at some length in the past around some of the failings of this. You know, we've shown you there what the DFE definition of small is. I'm not sure we necessarily agree with that, but that's the figure we work with. And it works on the basis of the next nearest school and a measurement of how the crow flies in terms of triggering that number. Now, Martin, you had a figure for this. I'm just trying to remember what the figures were. How many schools in Cambridgeshire actually trigger? It's about 20, 25?
No, so there's 57 primary schools which are underneath the 150 limit, which obviously qualifies them as small schools. Of those, only 17 actually qualify for sparsity funding due to the distance criteria.
So that's a concern for us. I think it's one of the things we need to be very mindful of when we go through the budget consultation about the impact on small schools. Obviously, the government promised this year a proper review of small schools. That hasn't happened for obvious reasons. We are told that review will now be shifted forward and it will be looked at in more detail. Now, obviously, the concern we have here is around small schools and the minimum per pupil levels. But again, we'll cover some of that as we move on to the next slide. Martin, do you want to take the next few?
Yeah, that's fine, John. So minimum funding guarantee, as has been in place for a number of years now, now has to be a positive value of between 0.5% and 2%. And just a reminder, this is a per pupil increase. I think in the consultation responses, as we'll see later, I think there was some confusion in terms of how the MFG actually operated. Alongside this, we've got the cap. There isn't a national cap. But again, we can look to use a local cap, and both the MFG and the cap are really there to try and ensure overall affordability in terms of the funding which is available. Equally, as we've had in previous years and as covered in the consultation, there is a 0.5% limit on movement between funding blocks, which is in the purview of Forum to approve. Anything over and above that would need Secretary of State approval for any transfer such as that. Early years block, as usual at this time of year, there's been very little announcements around the funding to do with early years. The only exception to that is the continuation of the maintained nursery school supplement until the summer of 2021. This was an area that when we met with the local MPs, that was discussed, because obviously this is something that just keeps rolling on year at the moment. It doesn't give it any certainty to the maintained nursery school sector at all. But it's one of the areas that the MP specifically asked to be covered in the letter that we sent forward. High needs block, obviously we're going to come in to talk about this in a lot more detail. I think the kind of headline figures that obviously there's an initial 730 million announced nationally. The minimum uplift any local authority can receive is 8%, and yet again we've received 8% in terms of that level of uplift, which again is obviously an issue in terms of our continuing demand that we'll come on to later in the presentation. Central school services block, so this is primarily to do with the kind of the retained duties for functions that the local authority still has, and the historic commitments that were in date prior to the changes in funding when they were introduced. As was the approach last year, the DFE are gradually reducing this year on year, so there's been a further 20% reduction in the historic commitments funding, which gives us kind of a net reduction of just under £1 million when compared to last year. Again, as you'd have seen in the consultation and later on in the documents, this will impact on the kind of the budgets which are funded through this route, specifically broadband, the broadband contract which is in place.
Okay, obviously the overall settlement then comes through in terms of where we sit in our relative funding. You'll remember probably 8 or 9 years ago we were at 150th out of 151. In terms of local authority funding. We did go up with a review of the national funding arrangements. So in 2019-20, we were at 135th by local authority. We are drifting downwards in terms of some of those measures, and our per pupil funding, much more generous than it used to be at 4,900 is still low and concerning. Do have to draw some parallels though. If you look at that table, particularly around Peterborough, because I can give an easy comparison there. The gap between Cambridgeshire and Peterborough at one stage was over £500. It's now down to around 300. So there has been some equalisation, which was the government's intention of a national formula. But unfortunately, we still feel, as a result of the settlement, the pressures on the high needs block and the general challenges we face with small schools and some of our schools and the circumstances, that the funding is still insufficient. And Cambridgeshire has significant challenges, yet is so low down on that measure that we feel that is unfair. So, John, I think we'll probably stop there for comments and to take any questions on the sort of national funding settlements before we get into the more detailed arrangements.
Okay, thank you, John. Martin. As previously stated, if any members have questions on the contents of this section, would they please use the raise blue hand function on the right of their screen now to show this? Not that I can see that easy because we're still sharing, so I might need a bit of help with that. Anybody got any comments? Bearing in mind that some of these points are covered earlier on. Peter? Peter Downs? I need to unmute Peter.
Yes, thank you. It's a question. It's just a factual question rather than a comment. Just to be clear for the schools I'm associated with, the reason that we are low down that list is not a punitive step by government against relatively affluent areas. It is simply that that's the way the formula works out. I mean, people keep saying Cambridgeshire should be higher up the table, but just to be quite clear in my mind, we've got a national funding formula, and the reason that our funding is low is that we don't hit the factors which would increase it. Have I understood that correctly?
That is correct, Peter. But equally, we have things like growth that's not properly represented in the formula, and other challenges that simply don't get picked up. So I wouldn't disagree, but I'll also say that there's some flaws in the national formula which we'll certainly explore in the coming up slides.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I can't see any other raised hands. So at this particular stage, especially as we're picking up some of these issues as we go through the presentation, can we agree to note the funding announcements, the national funding announcements? And in which case then can I ask Martin to introduce the next section on the high needs block and consultation process that has been undertaken?
Okay, so I think, Martin, shall I just run through these and then you pick up the next section? So in terms of the high needs block, obviously this is going to be a bit like Groundhog Day because we're going to be talking very similar challenges to what we discussed this time last year. This is the position with the high needs block for this year. So the decisions that were made last year around a nil transfer, the money we moved out of the centrally retained schools budgets, essentially the local authority element of it, and obviously the pressures we've got coming through, show that at the end of this year, pretty much in line with where we forecast, there will be a cumulative cash deficit on the dedicated schools grant of £28.5 million, which obviously is up on the 16 million from last year, but does fall in line with the activity and demand that we have on these budgets. Next one, Martin. That's great. Obviously for 21-22, we have had that uplift. So the extra additional funding we've received from government. Just to stress again, we received one of the lowest increases nationally. I think we're third lowest in terms of our overall increase. And within this funding includes additional funding for special schools in relation to teachers' pay and pensions that have come forward. The pressures we've got, I think, will probably be shown on the next slide. But we are pressured across the piece. COVID hasn't given us any respite from these pressures. If anything, we saw more Senkos busy when schools were closed, busy working on supporting children, which we completely support and endorse. But that has placed more pressures. And as it stands at the current time, our aspiration to be cash balanced, regardless of the deficit, is not the current position, nor can we sustain that with the additional funding that we've received. If you look at the next chart, this is our current projection. It's the historic projection of our education, health and care plans. That reality of April 17 to September 20, seeing an over doubling of the number of education, health and care plans, shows the challenges that we face. And I suspect any other local authority would have a very similar profile to this in terms of their position. One of the things that was promised this year was a review of SEN, national review of SEN. Again, that has not been published. A review of funding was also going to be undertaken, and that also hasn't been published yet. The government did release a paper yesterday on value for money with SEN that broadly suggested there wasn't enough money, which was very helpful. So that's the challenge we face, and the growth that is still coming through as a result of education and healthcare plans increasing. We have put together just a little bit more analysis here for you. You can see there on the left-hand side shows the amount per EHCP for top-up. I think our concern at the moment is if you look at the very tall column, that's 15,000 to 16,999. And this shows really the complexity of needs that are coming through in the primary phase. So a great deal more additional cost at the moment. So the needs are higher in that primary setting. Now, eventually that will come through into secondary. You know, those children needs don't decline. You know, they may change and they may go down. But our perception is that at the moment, because needs are getting more challenging, this position is only going to get more complicated going forward. And what we are seeing is that the average top-up rate per pupil continues to increase. And I always challenge head teachers, do we give out too much money? And the answer very firmly is no, we don't. And I think that's part of the challenge we face. The chart on the right-hand side shows the year-by-year comparison by year group, and you can see their steady increases across the year. We have a lot more checks and balances in place now in terms of challenging the level of top-up and reviewing placements, but the trend overall continues to be more cost coming through. Obviously, we've been doing lots of work on making savings in terms of the challenges around the high needs block. We
Have we lost John?
We have.
Looks like he's frozen. Yeah. Shall I carry on for a little bit until he comes back?
Yes, please, Martin.
Yeah. So as John said,
have reviewed or high cost placements and are in independent schools where we can say that and work it through. We are now around a reduction, and we're currently still working on. But over the summer, we've obviously continued to do further work about reduction. So, for instance, the behaviour improvement partnerships, that reduction has been made and will have taken effect from September. But we are also reviewing teams and structures. You know, we're in a quite delicate phase of that at the moment, so I can't go into lots of details today. But what I will bring back to you is a report on those savings and how we've delivered and how the structures will be changing to better support that activity. One thing we have looked at, and I've been challenged on this many times already, is around, you know, is the reduction happening on the council services in line with the school services? It is. That's one of our proposals, is to reduce the amount of expenditure we have in there. You know, please bear in mind the majority of the money, the vast majority of money, we're tipping towards 85% now, goes directly out into the school system. But in terms of our staffing complement in the high needs block, it is at the same level as it was at 2013-14. Yet our activity, particularly in relation to certain service areas, is nearly 4 times the level it was at that point. So whilst there hasn't been a direct reduction in overall numbers, the activity has quadrupled during that period. So, but we will bring you back more details on that. I say it's a delicate time. I can't go into details right now, but we'll certainly share that in the next meeting. Next slide, please, Martin. Oh, is he still there?
I think there's a bit of a lag on your end, John.
Is it? All right, I'll just assume the next slide is on then. So just a reminder of the deficit, and we did have some feedback on the consultation around this, that why isn't the local authority putting more money into the DSG to fund the overspend? We cannot do that. We physically are not allowed to do that anymore. We're certainly not in a financial position to do it anyway. There is an expectation that the deficit is met within the dedicated schools grant, and that continues to be the case. So, you know, we are pressured to continue to save that, and we will obviously, continue to look at ways we could save it. But ultimately, it is ring fence within that grant. and we will all have to deal with these issues. And I think we need to certainly bear that in mind when we come to the decision making on the transfer, although weighing up the relative pressure and impact is going to be really, really key. So I'll hand back to you, Martin, because my slides aren't updating, and let you move on to slide 17.
Yeah, no problem, John. Thank you. Yes, so obviously as part of the consultation, we sent out a number of illustrative funding allocations, which kind of looked at the potential different scenarios, just to give an indication of what would happen if we were to transfer different percentages, if we were to reduce the MFG, and we were to reduce the different caps to become in with overall affordability. So A, B, and C were the three scenarios that we sent out with the consultation, which obviously had varying impacts for different schools. I think, you know, the main things to note about those figures were that they all included the revised national funding formula unit values and the minimum per pupil levels for 21-22. As John's already alluded to, it was based on the October 2019 census. We have now received some of the October 2020 census, and for some schools there have been some quite significant changes in pupil numbers, which obviously will impact on the final figures at the individual school level. Again, what we noted last year, and is obviously still pertinent to this year as well, is that any school who have previously been funded below the minimum per pupil level will see an increase up to that new level, which has been set as a mandatory amount by government. However, on the converse side to that, any school which is already in receipt of minimum per pupil level will see variable levels of funding increases based on either their own characteristics or the overall affordability. The Education Policy Institute has done quite a bit of work looking at this, and you can see their comments there. And so effectively what this is doing, the national funding formula, is evening up the funding levels, and isn't seeing as much of a differential between the kind of the more affluent schools and those in more deprived areas. Similar information from the Institute of Fiscal Studies in terms of that impact that it's having on the different types of schools and the kind of the inequalities that potentially is causing in terms of the funding overall. So in terms of the actual consultation process, as per the kind of the requirements for us to consult with schools and schools forum, we need to consult on any changes to the formula being proposed and any transfer between the funding blocks. We've obviously tried to do the consultation earlier this year to be able to have these conversations with forum much earlier in the process, to try and get a little bit more certainty rather than having those discussions in January and February as we had at the beginning of this year. So in terms of the actual consultation responses, we received 80 submissions in total, which was a reasonable return, bearing in mind obviously some of those were from academy trusts, so representing a number of schools in terms of the area. In terms of the actual consultation events that John and I ran across Zoom virtually, I think we probably had in the region of around 200 attendees to that. So hopefully most people felt reasonably well briefed in terms of the information that we received. So the next few slides are just a little bit of a summary of the actual consultation results, but obviously you've also got Appendix 2, which provides a little bit more detail and more of the transcript in terms of the narrative responses from some of the schools and trusts. So just very quickly, just in terms of the proportion of schools that and trusts that returned responses, you can see in terms of the overall numbers there, and also in terms of who were actually submitting the responses in terms of head teacher colleagues and governor colleagues, etc. In terms of actual school mix, for those where it was from an individual school, 61 primaries, 9 secondaries and 2 special schools individually responded in terms of those consultations. So a reasonable response rate compared to previous years in terms of the numbers that we've actually had come in. So in terms of the first question, real main question in terms of the national funding formula and whether we should apply those rates from 21-22, I think we can safely say there's a very much consensus there in terms of the percentage who agreed with that approach. And, you know, the comment around movement to national funding for should be made as soon as possible. I think, you know, that is the approach that we have previously committed to in terms of that. And again, that will be something that we'll be looking to. So based on that response, I think the LA recommendation would be to implement the national funding rates as set out in the consultation. Then obviously the big question, we'll probably obviously need to have more of a debate around this, I suspect, is around the transfer between the schools block and the high needs block to support the pressures that John's alluded to, and what we've obviously discussed at length previously. In terms of that, so a 30% yes, 62.5% not in favour, with 7.5% saying they were unsure. I think we can argue with the comment around central government should be properly and effectively funding children with high needs across the country, and then obviously the county more generally as well. But obviously, as I say, we'll probably have quite a debate on that shortly. For those responses that did support the block transfer, the preference was for a 0.5% transfer. And in terms of those numbers there, relatively few people were in support of the 1.1% or the 3.8 million transfer, 3.8 million pound transfer, sorry. As we said in the consultation, once you start getting to these levels, it obviously starts having a significant impact on overall affordability, and will obviously have an adverse impact on those schools who are already above the minimum per pupil level. In terms of overall affordability, the minimum funding guarantee and the cap, I think the next two slides both talk about that. As I said earlier, I think there was a little bit of confusion with some of the answers we received in terms of the how the MFG actually works in terms of it being a per pupil protection amount in terms of that. But I think that probably kind of accounts for some of the responses that we've received there. Likewise with the cap, I think the recognition that, as I've mentioned earlier, it does have that impact on more prevalent on those schools who are already in receipt of a higher level above the minimum per pupil level, and that kind of the adverse impact it works in that. I think if you recall from the conversations we had last year, we did look at what we could do to try and offset that in some way, but unfortunately, due to the way in which the minimum per pupil level applies and the cap and MFG kind of interact, there are very limited options in terms of what we can do in terms of overall affordability there. In terms of that, I think again, once we get the final numbers through, it will obviously impact slightly differently. But again, our approach would be as we have applied in previous years, which would be to use that combination of the minimum funding guarantee and funding cap to balance within available resources. And in both of those instances, obviously the preference is to set those as high as possible. To obviously within what's available to obviously ensure as much of the funding as possible goes directly to schools. The next couple of slides are just in respect of the maintained primary sector, where we're asking around the continuation of dedelegations. I think, again, they're pretty strong support for all of those areas as we have done in previous years. And this shows the amounts that we would be proposing to put forward as they were set out in the consultation. The only exception to this at the moment is in terms of the insurance and the risk protection arrangements. We're actually going to send out some further information on this to allow schools a little bit more time to make a bit more of an informed decision. The original consultation response was very, very much in favour of supporting and staying with the local authority insurance scheme. However, we have had a few comments back where people felt that actually more of a comparison between the levels of cover and the value for money for each of the schemes might be more appropriate. So we will circulate something shortly for maintained schools to be able to see that information and make more of an informed decision there. Okay, I'll pause there now. Obviously, I think we'll probably need to have some debate around this area, but we can go from there. But I'll move it off shared now, so we can go back to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Martin, and to John as well. So as Martin concluded there, the second report recommendation asks to comment on the responses received to the consultation and proposed local authority approach, including obviously the option of the transfer between the schools block to the high needs block. Can I therefore ask any members wishing to raise questions on the contents of the section, please use their raised blue hand function now, please, and we'll try and get as many people to contribute as possible if people wish to make comments. So starting first of all with Andrew Reid.
Thank you, Chair. So it was a point of process which I think I may have missed. I understand there was 80 responses, and I understand that more than one school was represented potentially in each response. Do we know what percentage of schools in Cambridgeshire were affected by this have therefore been represented in the responses?
Sorry, Andrew, just be clear. So 80 responses, you want to know how many schools that represents? Is that the figure you're after?
Exactly. I appreciate we have what we have, but I mean, it would be good to know, wouldn't it, whether the responses that we represent 60% of the actual number of schools or whether it's 40%.
Yeah. Okay. Martin, I don't suppose we got that to hand, have we all?
No, I haven't got it to hand. In terms of what we asked for, we obviously asked for individual school names where it was, or for trust names. So I can obviously look through and see all the trusts that responded, and obviously work out which schools they were representing. But I haven't got that information to hand.
Thank you. I'm sorry to ask, but I think that's an important thing for us to know, because it gives us some indication, doesn't it, of how pejorative the view is expressed in the returns.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Is that something you can bring back or send out to forums at a later point?
No, we'll send it out, John. We'll get hold of it and send it out as quickly as we can, because I think it's important you see that. So that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Next, Adrian Ball.
Brilliant, thanks, John. John, or other John, this is, I guess, one of the questions we're being asked is to look at clearly the transfer of the 0.55% over. What would be the impact on you? I mean, I realise local authority can take 0.5 as is anyway, but to secure that approval, I guess what would be the impact on you guys if there was no approval and there was no transfer? What would be the impact on the level of service offered across the county over the next in 21-22 as a result of that?
Are you there, John? Oh.
Well, that answers that then, doesn't it?
Perhaps if John rejoins in a moment, comes back to that one, because it's an absolutely key question for us to ask, really. In which case, then we'll just pause you for a minute, Adrian. What we'll do, perhaps ask Susanna, but she might have a question as well in terms of directing that towards John Lewis. So we'll just hold that for a moment. Susanna, is there a question you want to ask?
Yeah, so firstly, the restructure taking place is really positive, but I'd like to know two things. So one is similar to what Adrian's asked, what is the actual impact on the schools if no transfer happens regarding EHCP funding, but also regarding the out of county provision, it's at 14%. Has that changed, gone down, gone up? Are we making any headway about bringing that back into county, because that's a high cost as well?
Okay, John, did you hear that question from Susanna?
I caught the end of it. Apologies, Adrian. I wasn't ducking your question either. Sorry, technology issues. So do you want to play them back, John, and I'll try and go through them if that's okay.
It's probably best if I go back to Adrian, because then both of those questions are linked. So first of all, Adrian, and then Susanna, if you follow after that, and then John can answer both of them together.
Yeah.
Okay, John, it was really about that impact of the transfer. Yeah, if no transfer was made, what would be the impact on the provision offered to schools by the local authority in 21-22?
And Susanna?
So mine, John, was the restructure taking place really positive, and regarding the transfer, what will be the actual impact on schools regarding EHCP funding, and also whether or not the 14% out of county provision has actually changed from the previous year. Are we bringing that down, or is it staying static or going up?
Okay, I'll deal with bits of these as I go. So the out of county placements have stayed broadly similar percentage wise of our cohort. we have seen an increase in need, so that the unit value is going up quite dramatically, but we are not an outlier compared to our statistical neighbours. So I'm just wondering whether it might be helpful I bring you some data on that to the next meeting to show you how our provision is changing. We've increased our special school places, so I suspect that will have a longer term benefit on out of county, but obviously that's in the context of a rising population as well. So that's going to cause more issues. In terms of the transfer, I'll kind of work backwards here, so I'll cover Susanna's, come back to Adrian's question. In terms of the transfer, if we transferred the 0.5% or the 1%, we would still have to reduce our support and commitment for EHCPs. That, you know, you've seen the figures. The transfer is a relatively nominal figure in terms of the overall position. Obviously, if you agreed it, we'd want a conversation with you about dealing with it, but it kind of nets itself off if we don't do that, and it makes very little impact on the overall deficit. You know, one of the things I haven't talked about is the council is still borrowing £28 million a year to fund this. That's costing us now over £600,000 a year in revenue costs, and we can't sustain that position anymore. Adrian, if I interpreted your question right in terms of the impact on schools of the transfer across, you know, I'm hugely worried about the impact on schools of taking 0.5% away or 1% away. You know, that I can't hide that actually, you know, as much as the high needs block is in a really challenging place, schools are as well, and I can see how many schools are close to going into deficit, and that's hugely concerning. You know, essentially any transfer would be moving cash to pay off a deficit and try and sustain our position. So you can see we're in a really difficult position here, and I'm being really honest about the position we're in. But the impact is going to hit somebody somewhere. You know, I guess my worry is at some point the government may turn around and say, deduct the whole £28 million off schools, and that could be more challenging than trying to do it bits at a time. So I think I may leave it there for further comment. Hopefully, Adrian, I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Can I just ask whether you've had sort of any contact with the department over the last few months in terms of actually the pressures on the SEN budget actually in Cambridgeshire? Yep. Obviously, that was a topic of conversation that we had back in January, February, that it was you getting that pressure. Has that continued?
We have had dialogue. Obviously, you'll remember that I went and met Nick Gibb, so Lucy Frazier organised that meeting. He promised us support around our high needs block and examples and best practice from elsewhere and advice on where to go. We've met with the DFE twice during this period. They still continue to tell us our activity looks right for our population. They're not worried that we're placing more children in one setting over another, or our rates are high. We seem to be perfectly steady with that. But they are not forthcoming on anything around the funding. So whilst our activity is great, the challenge of our funding hasn't shifted, and that's obviously a concern to us. We have written to them 4 times during COVID to request a cash flow advance to fund the deficit to deal with one of the issues, and the stock response we've received every time is it's COVID, we can't deal with it at the moment. So whilst I would say we've had good engagement with our DFE advisor, a chap called Brian Gale, who's been excellent. The support, the challenge, they're perfectly happy with everything we're doing. So we shared our plans on savings that are in that slide, but they don't really seem to be engaging any further than that. We recently received, there's a new template now for deficits and recording deficits. And to be honest, I think Martin's probably spent 2 months trying to figure out what they're asking us to send back. So it seems a complicated position, and certainly one of the things I'm very aware through my networks is that most other local authorities are now into a deficit, and we certainly aren't the biggest. But that's no real support for us, and I remain concerned that the DFE are not taking this seriously. Although you have seen the paper that's come out, or there is a paper that's come out of Value for Money that suggests that there is still challenges in this sector.
Can I just add there, John, sorry, that you just mentioned around that. So F40, who we've referenced previously, have just recently been conducting a survey to ask local authorities for the level of their DSG deficits overall. So we'll obviously share that information once that becomes available. And equally, the Society of County Treasurers are just undertaking a very similar exercise, looking just solely at high needs block deficits in totality. So again, it will be very interesting, as John says, to see what our relative position position is in terms of the overall deficits around this area. In terms of the template John referred to from the DFE, there seems to be much more of an emphasis of looking back at previous years rather than looking forward to see what we're actually going to be able to do to move this forward. So it does seem as there's a slight disconnect in terms of the process in that at the moment.
And sorry, just to add, John, just one other thing. Lucy Fraser again has been very supportive, and we are organising another meeting with Nick Gibb to talk about this. He's agreed to meet, so it may be appropriate, John, you join me and Simon Bywater to meet with the Minister to discuss it further.
Indeed, thank you. Susanna, did you have a follow-up question? Because I noticed your hand is still up, and then I'll move on to Richard.
Sorry, that's me not putting my hand down. There we go.
Okay, thank you. Richard Spencer.
Hello, thank you very much, John, to you and your team for the consultation detail and for the map scenarios. Coming in the time that they did has enabled us to have a much more meaningful discussion earlier, which I think has been really helpful. My question is about the potential to reduce top-up funding, the consultation later in the year. I note that the transfer impact this year would be disproportionately painful for our smaller primary schools in particular. That stands out quite strongly. Have you set about how far along are you in mapping different scenarios in terms of savings and the impact that reductions in top-up funding might have across the county?
Yeah, obviously we're very minded of that. We don't want to keep hitting the same schools with the reductions. So that's part of the analysis. Obviously, we're waiting for the updated census data. When we've got the full set of figures, we will do the comparison between what schools received from the high needs block, which we did previously, and try and make sure that there is not a disproportionate impact. The challenge we've got is that if we push to follow the national formula, we don't have much discretion on where we change and move things forward, but we will look at that, and that will be part of the consultation process. We just need to update our data sets when they settle to make sure we're fully understanding the impact, and it will be modelled.
Thank you.
Are there any further comments any members would like to make? Councillor Peter Downs.
Yes, thank you. Jonathan, you mentioned a few minutes ago that you think that more schools will go into deficit. Last year, you produced a very helpful list of school carry forwards. It was very, very revealing and indicated that there are some schools that are carrying forward enormous balances.
Yep.
One I remember was over £1 million of balance. And I've always found in my contacts with F40 and the government that the size of the carry forward is an embarrassment when we are pleading poverty. Are you going to be able to produce an up-to-date list of school balances for at the present time? Because we need to know that. We can't duck it.
So the only reliable source we have of balances is obviously published accounts. We don't yet. We won't have the new updated position for academies until I don't think they're required to be submitted till January. So the figures we've got, Peter, are the most accurate thing we can present. What I'm very minded of, though, when you looked at those figures, is it's quite a disparity. There are some huge surpluses. I would agree that there were a lot of schools with relatively small levels of balances. The factor that I'm worried about is obviously one thing is COVID costs that schools have had to spend out money that is not being recovered from the government. So that will eat away at some of that rainy day money that some schools have held. And when you looked at the analysis of the surplus balances, particularly small schools, particularly rural schools, they did not have high accumulated balances. So, we could sit and argue about why that is, the formula, deprivation, people premium, where it's going. But the reality is that there is a challenge there going forward. So maybe we need to have a reconsider of that. But bear in mind, the conversation we had last year is that we're not allowed to take account of balances. We're not allowed to pull balances back from schools. That can't be part of our consideration because that's not in our gift as forum to make decisions using that money.
Thank you, John. Adrian Ball.
Thanks. John, I'm not entirely sure whether this is a question or more of a statements, but it's more about you mentioned earlier about the future actions that the authority are taking to help reduce the deficit. And I get that if it's partway through or sensitive, you can't release detail publicly at the moment. I understand that, but for us in terms of representing the schools, it's important that we know what those actions are to reduce the deficit, because if it and it will clearly reduce the support that can be offered by the local authority, and therefore more of those actions will need to be undertaken at school level. Therefore, given the size of the deficit, a 0.5 transfer is unlikely really to touch the sides in terms of the authority deficit, but would have a much bigger impact at school level in terms of being able to deliver those services that are no longer being able to be delivered by the local authority. So for us to be able to, I think that's just important for us to be able to, at some point, ideally, if possible, at the next forum, to be able to understand that properly, because we've got to make sure that the schools can still provide that support. And if that means keeping the money at school level rather than transferring, then that might be the better option. But it's that piece of information in terms of making a true informed choice is difficult.
And I think there's the other side to that if I cut the central services, despite the money being there, it will differentially hit schools. So actually a school might be sitting on their 0.5% share of it, but find that actually they've lost 2%'s worth of support and activity that they then have to go and buy. So it's a really difficult position to work through, but we will bring you back more of that detail. There is quite a lot of detail that we haven't shared with you today about the savings that have already been made, and we'll pull that together. Obviously, what I want to try and do for the next meeting is almost share with you the consultation before we launch the consultation, so you can really see the whole totality of it. So that's the intention for the next meeting of Schools Forum.
Yeah, I think that would be really, really helpful, just to help put the whole picture together, and so we can weigh up all of the evidence that's available to us.
And just to say, this is why we've gone early with the budgets this year. It will give us more time to go through an iterative process, because even now we're and we want you to make a decision to help us. We can review that decision because we know things like the census figures will change. There's other factors that still will change, and we'll have 2 or 3 goes at this. So make decisions by all means, but they can be revisited as well.
So just to clarify that point then, John, this is perhaps potentially more of an advisory sort of decision that we're making, but it can still be reviewed.
Yeah.
Coming through.
Because ultimately you're not the decision makers in all these scenarios. So what we're trying to do is inform the CYP committee. We will take a paper to the CYP committee early next week, with Forum have said this in principle. They will come back, we'll update the figures, you'll have another go at it, and we'll go through that cycle a couple more times. So I think we need to see clear intentions, because that helps us model and understand where it is. But obviously we didn't know what you were going to request, and we will continue to sort of evolve the conversation to make sure you are as well as informed as you could possibly be at the last date when we have to consider your views. So that's what we're aiming to achieve.
Thank you, John. Ryan, then Susanna.
2 points really. The first, it relates to what Adrian just said. I think no one could accuse John of not working hard during the COVID crisis. I wake up to his emails every morning, so I know that's not the case. But I think to help us make this decision, we do need some more detail about various things. So I welcome the fact that we'll get some more information about staffing structures and cost savings there before we formalise a decision. I think it would also be good to have some more detail about what that 10% reduction in SEND funding might look like. And likewise, the one on there that has been going on for a long time is around the ERB review. I've been involved with the ERB review process for years now. It's been ongoing. The contracts are very out of date, and I think that's one we need to look to maybe expedite and just get some clarity about what that might look like. And I know there have been lots of challenges with COVID coming in. And the other thing I would say is that I would be keen for representatives from this group or other areas to be involved with helping and supporting the local authority with some suggestions around that. When we reduced the BATE funding for 10%, I know BATE Leeds put some proposals forward around how we might be able to save more money, but also improve the quality of provision from a school point of view. It was a bit disappointing that we didn't get any direct feedback about that. And I know we kind of had to pause things because of COVID, but we just kind of moved on with the 10% reduction. But I think there are things we could do alongside that. So fully understand where we are, and I welcome the fact that we're going to get a chance to have a bit more detail to make some decisions. The other point I just wanted to make was around the surpluses of academy trusts and so on, that it's not at an individual school level often, it's the academy, my understanding is that puts out its budget. And we are not allowed to put a deficit budget out as an academy. And if you were running a business, you would look to maybe have 10% reserves there to try and manage yourself through a crisis. I don't know, like COVID, where you've had to buy huge amounts. If I just take a school that I know well, where your income is £7 million a year, in business terms, then you would look to be having 10% of that as surplus, which would be 700,000. And we're being encouraged by the DfE to run our academy trusts in a sustainable financial way, to then be told that somehow that's inappropriate and we shouldn't be funding special needs because we're running academy trusts and keeping some reserves that mean we can respond to crisis seems a bit unfair. We shouldn't be running schools. If you're running 6, 5, 4, 10 schools, you shouldn't be budgeting to come in at 0 every year. If you're running a sensible, financially secure business, which is what an academy is, you should be holding back a certain amount of surplus. And if you've got £20 million coming in to your academy trust, therefore you should be holding back. If you were holding back 10%, you should be holding back £2 million. So to be criticised for doing that seems a little unfair.
Well, just coming back on that, Ryan, I don't think Peter was criticising schools holding a level of balances to support in the short term. I would say that exactly applies to maintain schools in exactly the same way. I think when we did look at the figures, that they were significantly above 10%, some of the schools. I think that was the challenge. So, but as I said, I think we could spend a lot of time talking about balances, and I don't think it's something that we need to engage with because we have no ability to do anything around it. It's useful to know. It's good to understand where their money is going and the surplus are creating, but it's a local management decision. It's not a decision for forum about the level of balances. So I think we should park that as an important point, but not one that's going to influence this decision making.
No, I agree. I'm happy to park it. I just think it's important to have the counter comment to that. And I recognise that Peter was probably just making the point that it could be perceived as problematic.
Can I just pick up on the point that Ryan made at the very start there about just input of schools for members into further developments? Is that something you'd welcome, John?
Yes, please. We obviously did a lot of work originally with people, and we were bringing along plans. So the other thing, Ryan, is the SEMH review is now finished. So we will be sharing that. So you can tick that one off after I think it was 11 years actually. That's been worked on. But we would look to reform some of those groups. To be honest, it's been pretty difficult because we've been stretched with lots of other things. But we'll take that back on board, and we'll be back in contact with the heads that we worked with previously, and obviously through you, John, to see if there's anyone else that would like to join those discussions.
Okay, thank you. Susanna?
I'm just reiterating what has been said. So it's good that we're going to have crystal clear impacts. So thank you for that, John. I know you said park it, but I'm going to unpark it for a second because the surpluses go back to our funding levels, and it's not just academies, it is also maintained schools. Yep. But those surpluses are targeted, and what the government needs to understand is, for example, we have ring fenced in one school part of the surplus because they won't provide us a SIF bid, and we're running out of buckets regarding the roof. So, it is about that funding level, and it is about being underfunded. And I think what we need to understand is how much of those surpluses are actually ring fenced and targeted at specific things, rather than just we're sitting on a huge amount of money that we're not going to be using. It's about supporting our schools because we're constantly underfunded. And now I'll park it, sorry.
No, you're fine. You're right to unpark it. one of the things we did discuss doing previously, and we even developed the data collection to do it, and we did collect some data, is around trying to understand the levels that are set in Cambridgeshire in a positive way. So when we go to members, we can say, actually, of our 26 million or whatever we've got, 13 million pound of that is being spent or is being reserved for things that you should be funding, and this amount is to rainy day money, and the ESFA requires this amount is set aside for redundancy. I think reinvigorating that conversation, I think, as we come into probably in the new year, would be incredibly helpful, particularly as we see some stabilisation of figures when published accounts come out from academies. So I may bring that back if people are happy to do that.
Yeah, I think that'd be a useful conversation. I think, you know, Peter's point about perceptions and so on is absolutely key in there as well, if we're going to make this argument going forward. Just looking down the list, probably starting to wind this up a little bit now. So go to Guy Underwood.
Thank you, John. Could I just pick up on Richard's point, which I think was great to hear, about the maybe a bit of a focus needed for small primary schools to understand better the funding challenges, and wonder before next forum whether we could do some specific work on that to understand a bit more the figures, the modelling that's going around that sector.
Guy, I think that's absolutely key. Should we pull together a meeting of those schools that meet the sparsity criteria and just have a dialogue and discussion about the funding and how it works? I think I'd quite like to explain it in a bit more detail to those schools, because I think there is a bit of lack of understanding maybe of what it means, but equally get some feedback on what the impact currently is having on them. Is that a sensible thing to do?
I think that would be excellent. I'd be really happy to engage you on that, John.
Yeah, brilliant. I'll be in touch and we'll organise that to happen. And I think it's important that we get the diocese there as well, because obviously they're proportionally represented higher in that group, and you know, obviously the trust join us as well for their schools that are in that sort of group and criteria.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to make one last look down the list of names. See if anybody else has raised their hands. I can't see anybody else. So in which case then we'll conclude this up. Last person, Andrew.
I just wanted to make one comment which relates to a previous comments, but the meetings I've had with DFE, and particularly senior politicians, would suggest that I'm not sure that it's any more a question of us convincing people that we're right. I think that may be a tribute to the work that's already gone in with meetings like with Nick Gibb. And I think, but it's more a question of whether whether anybody is actually able to do anything about that, even if they agree with us. So I just concerned that we don't predicate any of our decisions on the idea that central government is in a position to help, even if they can see that we have a strong argument.
Did you want to make a comment on that, John?
I think that's the dilemma I described at the start, a rock and hard place we're in, because you know, at some point this might come home to hit us, and you know, that decision about not doing it puts off a challenge. But equally, what does putting off that challenge mean for schools immediately, and you know, particularly in the context we're working in? You know, it's the lesser of two evils we may be arguing for here. So I'll leave that thought with everyone as you move on to the vote.
As I say, I think we'll move on to the vote. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll move on to the vote in a moment, and then perhaps a bit of a conversation after that about actually perhaps what our next steps actually are, even if that's to come back and have a fuller conversation in January. So, because we can't really be in this situation every single year, really, in terms of trying to resolve this issue between the school and the high needs block. But probably the last person we'll go to, Councillor Bywater.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just really want to come back on what Andrew's said there in relation to, you know, our productive meetings with the MPs that John and I had on, I think the 23rd, John, wasn't it? I think the arguments are really stacked in our favour. I think, you know, they can't really argue with the points that we put forward. It's whether they can make any effective change for us, really, because Andrew, John and some members here, we've been having this argument and this dilemma for the last, well, since I've been chair of CYP for the last 4 years. And all we seem to see is a deficit getting bigger and bigger, and something's got to give at the end of the day, really. I'll leave it there, Chair, and I'll let you go to your decisions.
Okay, thank you. In which case then, what we're going to do now then is move to the third recommendation, which requires a vote on the approval of a block transfer between the schools block and the high needs block. I'll do a roll call of the voting members, and whether you can please indicate when I read out your name, whether you agree or disagree or wish to abstain on whether the block transfer between the schools block and the high needs block should take place. Rob, if I read out all the names, because you might know who's joined the call and who hasn't joined the call, if someone's actually absent, please could you just tell me that is the case. So I'm going to start the roll call of names now on this particular recommendation. Simon Bainbridge.
Hello, yep. I agree with a transfer.
Adrian Ball.
I disagree.
Liz Bassett.
I disagree.
Christopher Bennett.
I disagree.
Susan Connell.
I disagree.
Tony Davis. He's not on the call.
I disagree.
Oh, thank you. Ryan Kelsall.
Disagree.
John King.
I disagree.
Jeremy Lloyd.
I disagree.
Leah Miller.
I agree.
Claire Palmer.
Disagree.
Deborah Parfitt.
I agree.
Patsy Perez.
I agree.
Richard Spencer.
Disagree with the transfer.
Paul Stratford.
I disagree.
Guy Underwood.
I disagree.
And my vote is to disagree.
You also need Joanne Hardwick.
I agree to the transfer.
Can I ask please then the Democratic Services read out the result?
5 in favour agreeing, 13 against. That's lost, the transfer.
Okay. Thank you very much. As John and Martin and others have said, it's an incredibly difficult decision, and it's not the first time we've actually been placed here really through the situation regarding funding. Obviously, John, could you just recall for us what the next steps actually are? What do you intend doing from this point onwards in terms of over the next few weeks, but also before you come back to Schools Forum again? So, John, you're still muted.
Apologies, difficult on a phone. Next stages are we will take your feedback to the CYP committee next week. We will share, obviously, your view around the disagreement and the discussion that's happened today, because I think it's really important that we replay some of the dilemma that you faced and the process you will go through. Obviously, in the meantime, we will continue to develop the formula, share the information, and I think we'll come back to the next meeting to say, in light of the updates, this is where we are. Do you want to reconsider your decision? And we will go through that iteration right up until January. I think it's on the end of these slides where we finalise the budget on the 19th of January. So I completely respect the outcome that you put together. We haven't yet, as officers, formed a view. Obviously, one of the decision making is, do we go to the Secretary of State and override the view of Schools Forum? I didn't want to do that. I don't want to tell you whether we're going to do that or not, because I wanted to hear the debate and discussion. At the next meeting, we will certainly come back with a view from the committee, and it's obviously the committee members, whether they wish the officers to seek to override the view of Schools Forum. Obviously, you remember the last year we went through the dialogue and debate about a 1.8% transfer, which we did request when Forum view was a nil transfer. So we'll bring that back to the next meeting to update you and have that dialogue and debate about the council's view on the budget settlement.
Thank you very much, John. And just going back to the comments from members before we actually did the vote, there is that question about, well, where do we go really from here? That actually we've made as much of a convincing argument as we possibly can do, and yet we're still at the same point of not actually having enough money really in the high needs block in order to deliver what we want. Whether it's not necessarily the appropriate time now, but certainly when we meet again, we do need to have that conversation, that debate and discussion as a group in terms of actually what do we suggest the local authority does or we do collectively. When we're having those conversations with MPs, we're having that conversation with officers in the department, and yet we're still left in this particular situation. So it might be something which I'm just asking all members of Forum to reflect upon really before we meet again. Actually, what alternatives are there? What suggestions are there? because, you know, as John said right at the very start, and Martin has said as well, we're faced with hard choices. At the end of the day, there's going to be impact upon school. There's clearly going to be an impact upon the SEN services. And when John comes back, I think we'll get a much better picture of that. But, you know, the situation is not going to be a pretty one, regardless of whatever decision is actually reached. So I do think there is a further debate for Forum to actually have. And certainly what we don't want to be doing is obviously end up in a situation of conflict or disagreement with the local authority as we go forward. Okay, thank you very much. In which case then what we'll do at this stage, we'll move on to the next item really, and Martin was just covering that at the end of his presentation. This is actually on the de-delegations. And the next recommendation is a vote for only those who are maintained primary representatives on schools forum. And I think we can probably do this en bloc unless any of the primary maintained representatives would wish to have a vote on any of the individual elements. So the recommendation 5 asks you to approve the continuation of de-delegations in respect of contingency, free school meals eligibility, maternity and trade union facilities time. Can I ask therefore the following in turn if they approve the continuation of the 4 listed de-delegations? So starting with Liz Bassett.
Yeah, I think we all we agreed these as a group. We met earlier in the week and we agreed all these.
Okay, in which case, unless Guy Underwood or Tony Davis suddenly say something else, I'm happy to accept the 3 of you are in favour of the de-delegations.
Approved.
Yeah, fine by me.
Okay, thank you very much. In which case then, can I ask Martin and John to introduce the next section on the central services block?
Okay. Central School Services block. So as I alluded to earlier, the Central Services block has historic commitments has been reduced by a further 20% this year, in line with the DFE's previous commitment to reducing the block over time. What the table on slide 34 shows is the budget allocations which were approved in the current financial year and the proposed approach to take for 21-22 in terms of the overall funding that's available. So in totality, we had 4.6 million available in the current year. That's reduced to about 3.7 million for 21-22. What we're doing here is proposing that we reduce the contribution to children's services, otherwise known as contribution to combined budgets, by a further $500,000. We reduced this by about $1.5 million last year, I believe. So we just reduced this by a further $500,000, and then the proposal will be to reduce it for a further $500,000 for the next 2 years until that contribution has gone entirely. The early intervention family workers funding is to keep that amount the same. Broadband contract we'll talk about in a minute in terms of that, but again, that would be to reduce by a further 20%. As John alluded to on one of the earlier slides, last year we had the kind of the balancing figure, if you like, was then moved to the high needs block to support that, as we've done in the previous 3 years in totality. Again, the intention will be to move the residual 1.1 million to the high needs block on the same basis as we have done in previous years. In that, so no real changes to previous practice, but obviously the figures have changed in terms of the overall affordability for that block. In terms of broadband itself, I think, as we've said previously, I think the key things to remember here is that in other authorities, they haven't got this centrally retained fund. This is just due to the contract that we had in place when the funding arrangements changed in terms of that. So other authorities, schools are already paying for this in full, whereas we've been able to kind of either fund it fully in the last few years, and obviously now last year and this year still continuing with a reasonably high level of subsidy over and above what we've had previously. So in terms of the cost proposals, they're set out in the table on the current slide. So it still works out as a 60% subsidy, with 40% of the cost being met by schools. Obviously, going forward, we'll have to look at what happens to this in future years, because obviously at some point we are likely to reach a tipping point in terms of that overall funding. As part of the central services block as well, there's the retained funding element. For those of you that can remember, it used to be part of the education services grant element that was received by the local authority and by academies as well. There's an element that we've had in place since this was introduced, which remains at £10 per pupil for retained duties. That applies to all schools, and equally an education functions element that applies to maintained schools only. As I say, these amounts have been set at the same amount as in since their introduction when this function was transferred across, and cover a number of functions provided for the local authority for both maintained schools and academy schools. So obviously take any questions on that subject, but these are the kind of required actions in terms of both approval and commenting on the particular issues in respect of the central services block.
Thank you very much, Martin. Again, at this particular point, do any members wish to raise any questions, queries or comments? If so, please do raise your blue hand. I can see Liz. You haven't got a blue hand, but
Haven't got a blue hand. I've got a clap and a wave or a thumbs up, but not a blue hand. We had a discussion earlier on about this, and we wanted to find out probably the same question that Tony, and Tony might voice it better than me actually, but we wanted to know a bit more about what the contribution to the children's services went towards, what it was for.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I've returned, so apologies for disappearing again. This funds additional EP support. It funds youth services. It funds support from central services within the council. We did produce a list last year to Schools Forum. Happy to provide that again, but they are services directly contributing towards schools. What we've been trying to do through reduction is obviously we understand that we can't forever have this contribution there, so we are slowly replacing it with core council funding. But the council is having to cut other services to deliver it. So if you choose not to do this, you'll see an instant reduction in those services to schools, and it would hit every school in the county because it's more on the universal side of SEN that's not high needs funded that would be cut initially, but it does cover some of the social care elements as well. So it's propping up some of the early help offer that you receive too. That's another area which that's currently funding. So by tapering it down, we're hoping to remove the cost there. But we're happy to provide that list again, as we've done in the last 2 years.
So bearing in mind that schools are absolutely desperate for EP support, then they don't have enough to even fulfil the statutory duties often, they have to wait for EP. Is it wise to be tapering it down further, or should it stay at the same as it was last year?
Well, if you were to say to me, can we keep it at 1.5 million and put an extra 500,000 into education psychologists, I'd be absolutely delighted. But at the moment, what I'm going to offer, Liz, through this reduction is I can keep the numbers the same. That's what we're trying to do. So you won't see a reduction in your support because we've planned for this. We've made savings elsewhere to fund it, but there will be no growth. And I agree with you. We need more education psychologists. We have up to that cohort. But if Forum chose to invest further by not reducing this, again, I'd be delighted to do that. So maybe that's something you want to debate now.
Well, you mentioned earlier that if people didn't do the 0.5% transfer and didn't do the 10% from the top up, it would have to go from other services.
Yeah.
And I personally think that would be the best way to go forwards, because I think we've got to be really clear about the real cost of SEN in schools. And
Great.
So I personally would like to see that staying at the same level rather than being reduced down further. I don't know what my other CPH reps would say about that, but.
Comments from any other members on that particular point?
I think, John, just to clarify, because it might help people to understand, is that this is where funding gets complicated. So EPs are a local authority funded service, not a high needs block funded. So, again, we probably need to bring you back some of the charts and diagrams to explain the difference between the two. And this transfer here relates to everything that's in the council budget as opposed to the high needs block budget. So it's very complicated, and I'm minded that we may need to explain that in a little bit more detail for the next meeting.
But the impact is on our high needs in school. That's
absolutely. You know, the two correlate. It's a bit like homeschool transport. The two interact with whatever you deliver in a school affects the homeschool transport budget. Yet they sit completely separate and are funded by different routes. So you know, there's a direct correlation. So you know, we would be happy to look at if we had £500,000 extra, what could go through. Obviously, the budget we presented to you and what schools have received. If we didn't, we've assumed this transfer is going to happen, and we lose the £500,000. They would change the figures, so there would be a knock-on impact on individual schools' budgets from what we previously presented. Am I right there, Martin, or am I not?
No, not right there, John. Actually, so because this is the central school services block, it's outside of that already. So, so if we were to hold the contribution to combined budgets at 1.5 million, what we'd probably do is on the bottom of that previous slide where it had the contribution to high needs block.
Yeah, it goes down.
That would reduce by £500,000 to balance overall. That we would have to balance it within the central services schools block. I think just to clarify as well, what John was saying as well is that we've already allowed for that £500,000 reduction within. So as you said, it's been replaced by council budget, so it wouldn't reduce the Ed Sykes. It wouldn't reduce the Ed Sykes service.
Yeah, and just one final thing. Sorry, John, to come in again. The transfer to the high needs block, so the 1,085,000 we're proposing, we don't have to do that. You know, we could sit on that money in our central schools budgets, but you know, we want to contribute. We know that there is a need to make it happen. That's why we do it. So I'm conscious lots of you are quite, you know, challenging to us of your staff numbers in that area. Well, we understand that, but we are trying to make a contribution as well. That's why we could spend that money on other things. We are allowed to. Could spend more money on admissions, for instance, which is funded in this area. But we're not. We're trying to free up every penny to try and impact upon that high needs block budget overspend.
Okay, thank you, John. Tony?
Thank you. I haven't got a blue hand either, so I'll keep putting my thumbs up to try and get attention. So everybody thinks I'm agreeing with everything that everybody's saying, I guess. My question was about the early intervention family workers. And I'm wondering, I know that's been a service we just found invaluable as a school, but we haven't had access to one in our locality for a considerable amount of time now. I think since last time the budget was set. So I'm wondering, actually, have all these people been recruited, and did we spend last year's budget? And if the money actually isn't being spent and the recruitment isn't happening for early intervention family workers, can we justify transferring the money again if it's not actually happening?
So I'm happy to bring back a more detailed paper, Tony. This wasn't part of my service this time last year. It's now moved in, so it now sits under Anna Wayland. So we are going back and filling. I think there is some proposals around looking at how we dedicate those resources. My understanding is we have a handful of vacancies, but I can't confirm that. So why don't I bring back a paper just showing you where those resources go and the numbers and how they're deployed across the county, because obviously it's a county-wide service. So there will be support in different parts of the county at different levels.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. In which cases I can't see any more hands or any other indicators that anybody else wishes to speak, we'll move on then to actually sort of looking at this particular recommendation. So recommendation 6 asks schools forum to approve then, given the fact that John will also come back with further information. Reduction in contribution to children's services 1.5 million to 1 million. Continuation of £733,000 to support early intervention family workers. The transfer of 1.85k from the central services school block to the high needs block. Continued use of the retained duties funding within the school central block to support ongoing functions, and the continued retention of £10 per pupil from maintained schools for services specifically provided to maintained schools. So what I'll do is again go through the roll call of everybody and ask you whether you're in favour, you're against, or you wish to abstain. Before I do so, Rob, who did I miss out from the list last time round?
It was Joan Hardwick. I think she's on the list. I think it's just the way it came off the page, possibly, on the last vote.
My apologies, Joan. In which case, then, I'll go through the list of names. Simon Bainbridge.
The joy of going first again.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
I'm in favour.
Adrian Ball.
Yeah, in favour.
Liz Bassett.
In favour.
Christopher Bennett.
In favour.
Susanna Connell.
Agreed.
Tony Davis?
Yep, agreed. I guess we just that question about early intervention family workers, but I'm sure that'll be resolved.
Thank you. Joanna Hardwick?
Yes, agreed.
Brian Castle?
Agreed.
John King?
Agreed.
Jeremy Lloyd?
Yeah, agree.
Leah Miller?
Agreed.
Claire Palmer?
Agreed.
Deborah Parfitt?
Agreed.
Patsy Perez?
Agreed.
Richard Spencer?
Agreed.
Paul Stratford?
Agreed.
Guy Underwood?
Agreed.
And I agree too.
That's unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Recommendation 7 asks schools forum to comment on a proposal for schools to be charged 40% of the current broadband costs following the further reduction in funding. Can any members wishing to raise questions about this particular recommendation raise the blue hand function, or in other ways indicate they wish to speak? Okay, again, I can't see anybody wishing to comment on this.
John, sorry, can I just come in? Apologies, I can't put a hand up either.
Okay.
Just a comment, just to let you know, I'm aware there are some, there's a couple of challenges that we're getting. I've been working with some of the academy trusts around one of the elements of our broadband agreement, but I just wanted to reassure the members of the forum that we're working through that issue about it's to do with the filtering on the network, and you know, I'm very keen and clear that this system needs to work completely for schools. So I just wanted to lodge that in case obviously you get any feedback from other people about this.
I'm just in a meeting, but I can talk very briefly if you want. Yeah.
Tony, you need to be on mute. Okay, thank you very much, John. In which case then we'll move on to growth fund and new school funding. And again, can I ask please Martin Wade to introduce the next section?
Okay, so growth funding, no real proposed changes to the approach that we've taken in the current financial year. I think one thing just to note is that actually the inclusion of head teacher representatives on the growth fund panel has been really helpful, and as we found it really beneficial in terms of the additional level of challenge we're getting, and feel as though that process is you know, extremely robust now in terms of the decisions which are being made. In terms of the current in-year position, so if you remember, we retained a growth fund of £2 million in totality. To date, we have allocated 1.85 million of that funding, which has gone to fund diseconomies funding across new schools and growth funding for primary and for secondary schools. We're hoping that there might not be too many more allocations to make this year, because we're just waiting obviously for the October census data. But obviously if that is the case, there'll be a slight underspend there, that which will obviously count towards the overall DSG position at the end of the year. So based on the criteria, keeping the criteria the same for next year and keeping the funding amounts the same for next year as well, based on the allocations which have been agreed previously as shown on this slide. I think based on the data that we've got today, and we're proposing keeping the essentially retained growth fund at the same amount of 2 million. In terms of the overall numbers. We're still waiting, as we said earlier, for the final census data to come through, and what we're starting to see now is the kind of the bulge in primary that we've been seeing for the last sort of 7 years is obviously now filtering through into secondary quite significantly. So we're seeing kind of a bit of a slowdown in the primary growth, but quite a significant increase in the growth in some of our secondary schools, and obviously with the kind of new developments in certain parts of the county as well, we're seeing some of those numbers start to increase quite significantly for some schools, although again because of the current pandemic that has slowed down slightly on previous projections in terms of that. So based on initial estimates in terms of growth fund we expect to get from the Department for Education, we expect that it's going to be slightly less than we've received in previous years because of that slowdown in primary growth in terms of work, but we still think that's going to result in a subsidy required from schools in the region of £1 to £1.5 million based on the amount of funding we get from the DFE and the total cost of growth for new schools and expansion of the schools. And that's in line with what it's been for last year. If you remember, in the first year, the Department for Education changed the methodology. That required subsidy was significantly higher because of the level in drop-off in funding compared to previous years. So I say hopefully we'll be at similar levels as we were in the current year. In terms of new school funding, we're not proposing any changes to the way in which new schools are funded. Again, this is something we have been pushing DFE in terms of trying to come up with some national way of funding new schools, which is consistent across the piece. What we are seeing, however, is a slightly more of a requirement from the DFE for when we're opening new schools to kind of almost underwrite the numbers that we're going to be funding in those initial years of opening. And as you can see, for some schools which aren't opening for 2 or 3 years' time, obviously in terms of forecasting the current situation, that's actually quite difficult to do. That said, that is the approach we have taken with recent new schools that we've opened, Littlebore, Northstowe, for example, where we have kind of guaranteed the 120 per year group in those initial years of opening to give some stability whilst they filter to capacity over those initial years. What we also do is for any new schools which are still filtering into capacity, we submit their numbers through what we call variation to pupil numbers, and for those numbers, so we look at the overall number of classes those schools are required to open to give capacity whilst they filter capacity through those initial years. These are the initial numbers we're proposing for those new schools that kind of fall into that category at the moment. Some of them we are still will need to have further discussions with place planning colleagues and with the individual schools in question to agree the numbers. But again, this is in line with the practice that we've used previously in terms of the overall number projections going forward. So again, pause there to take any comments on those areas before going to asking Forum to approve.
Thank you very much, Martin. A question to start with to John, really. Are you happy with any proposals being brought forward by the Department for Education for opening new schools in the county? Do you think they're needed? And if not, what steps does the local authority take to actually sort of communicate this to the department? Because obviously every single time a new school is built, it actually cuts into the funding for all others.
Yeah, so if I start with the last point and then work my way backwards, yeah, we have made representation repeatedly. You know, Cambridgeshire is one of the highest growth areas in the country, and whilst the economy is booming and contributing more to the GDP than other parts of the area, schools unfortunately have to pay for it. So that point continues to be made, and it will feature as one of the points of the MP's letter again about the impact of that. In terms of free schools, we are still finding out the implications of Wave 12 and Wave 13 bids. You know, there's a one Wave 13 bid that hasn't had a published outcome, and we learnt recently that a Wave 12 bid in relation to St Bede's for a new school in Soham has been agreed, and we've made our representations to the department around the impact that school would have, particularly as we are concerned about the basic need requirements for that school, and obviously that's going to be subject to discussion at the CYP committee next week. So if members of the forum wish to read the detail and background, it's part of that report. You know, we are concerned, you know, every time we add a new school place, everyone pays, and we need to make sure that when we use that mechanism, it's for a proper need rather than necessarily just meeting maybe a government scheme or objective. So we have made strong representation that we don't believe there's a basic need for that school at the current time. There will be a need in a future date, and that's obviously going to be subject to the CYP committee writing back to the minister who has made the decision on that school.
Thank you very much, John. Richard?
Hi, thanks for that, John. I see that in the paper it talks about an increasing requirement from the DFE to fund guaranteed numbers for new schools. Yeah. In relation to the Soham free school that you mentioned, as the local authority doesn't feel that basic need requirements have been met, do we have any scope to decline to guarantee funded numbers in the case of that free school or any school where, as an authority, we believe there isn't a place's basic need?
I may defer to Martin there, because I think there's almost a guarantee for a period with a free school, and then after that it's subject to local consideration. Martin, is that right? My understanding?
Yeah, that's how it usually works. I mean, I suppose that is a question going forward about how the funding for all of these new schools is actually going to work in practice. But theoretically, it shouldn't have a significant impact on the school's budget. I think that the key thing is it's where we have gone through the process to open new schools, and then we're then being challenged by the DfE. I think their expectation is when a new school opens, it opens full, and so they expect it to kind of be full as at day one. Whereas obviously the reality, especially where we're supporting a new community, is that we will be filling over a period of time. But we can look into the free school a little bit more. But as I say, this is where we've been pushing for some sort of clear and consistent approach to funding new schools, which can be applied nationally, so that no other schools are losing out when new schools are opened in a specific area.
Thank you, Martin. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Bear with me, I'm just going to find my paperwork. I think it's on Appendix 3, 3.2. Other considerations. Just want to know, because it's saying the level of revenue balance for maintained schools and academies will be requested and considered as part of the application process. So what they're saying, any schools with a revenue balance deemed as excessive would not be permitted to claim on the full value of the additional growth funding. What do we deem? What's the clarification on excessive? What do we deem as excessive?
So I think we revert back to the former government definition, which was 5% of the formula budget for secondaries and 8% for primaries. But obviously, it would be a dialogue and debate about why that money is there and how much is needed. Obviously, a free school is a free school, as in a new school. Sorry, not a free school. A new school is not a gift. There is always costs associated with it. And actually, they would still be looking after 3 years, for instance, for ICT replacement. So we would always have that discussion and dialogue with a school about that figure. But it's not hard and fast, because it's very hard to say what is reasonable. And you've heard that dialogue and debate earlier.
Okay, thank you, John.
Okay, thank you very much. Any further comments on the Growth Fund? In which case, so one last check, and just make sure I'm missing anybody's hands. In which case, then, recommendation 8, ask schools form to approve continuation. We missed somebody. Okay. Continuation of the current Growth Fund criteria. Continuation essentially retained Growth Fund 2 million. Variation to pupil numbers for new schools, and underwriting of pupil numbers for new schools in the future. We can now proceed to vote on this. Again, when I call your name, could you indicate if you're in favour, you're against, or you wish to abstain? So, Simon Bainbridge.
In favour.
Adrian Ball.
Yeah, in favour.
Liz Bassett.
In favour.
Christopher Bennett.
In favour.
Susanna Connell.
In favour.
Tony Davis.
In favour.
Joanne Hardwick.
In favour.
Ryan Kelsall.
Favour.
John King.
In favour.
Jeremy Lloyd.
In favour.
Leah Miller.
In favour.
Claire Palmer.
In favour.
Deborah Parfitt.
In favour.
Patsy Perez.
In favour.
Richard Spencer.
I am in favour, but I'd like us to explore what scope we have not to underwrite pupil numbers where, as an authority, we don't believe there's a basic need.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back next meeting about that. Paul Stratford.
In favour.
Guy Underwood.
In favour.
And I'm in favour too. Can I ask Democratic Services to confirm the vote?
That's unanimous again.
Thank you very much. In which case, then, that concludes the report, and we now move on to the last item on the agenda, Schools Forum Agenda Plan. And can I ask, please, Rob Sanderson to present that report?
Yeah, it's very much as set out, with the next meeting to be held on 16th of December. For the next meeting, there'll be addition of update report on the current membership and to review appointments to be made, as there are 4 vacancies that have been identified for academy representatives. And also, as John Lewis indicated earlier, he would also be looking at what can be done with regard to obtaining, if you like, a more diverse schools forum going forward. Obviously, with regard to school funding update, there'll be all the requests picked up from today's meeting, where there's requests for more information to come forward to the next meeting. And also there's, I believe, the high needs recovery plan will also be, there'll be some information on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. So,
just on the January meeting, the high needs paper that's listed there, that's likely to change to be a high needs consultation paper, I believe. Sorry, that's it.
okay, thank you very much. John, Martin, any further comments on that?
No, thank you all very much.
Okay, any of the members of Forum wish to ask a question about the forward agenda plan? No. Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask then that Forum actually notes the agenda plan? And that actually concludes today's business. Therefore, can I thank you all for your attendance over the last hour and a half, and also for any people watching this. And I now declare this meeting closed. I hope everybody keeps safe and well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.